I want to let listeners know that this week's episode gets into a number of adult themes, may not be appropriate for young children. So adults listening with young or middle or even older children may want to listen to this first. Today is February 26, 2024, and my guest is Megan McArdle. This is Megan's 8th appearance on EconTalk. She was last here in March of 2023 talking about the Oedipus trap. Megan, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our topic for today is where we're headed as a culture vis-a-vis the internet, using some of the latest developments in AI as a jumping off point. I want to mention to listeners that back in 2017, which it's like the Ice Age or Neanderthal man was walking the earth. In 2017, we had a unfortunately prescient conversation about outrage and shaming online, which at the time seemed very fresh and a novelty item. And right now, what people are talking about and anxious about is not the topic that we spent numerous episodes here on EconTalk talking about, which is AI safety. That's the question of whether we're all going to be turned into paper clips or kidneys extracted by dangerous robots, but rather, what are the latest tools of the internet and artificial intelligence going to do to us as human beings and as a culture? And that seems, in many ways, a little more relevant, at least today. Megan, why don't you start us off?
Oh, wow. That is a big topic. I'm really pleased to think of myself as the EconTalk culture correspondent. It's funny. I was, for no particular reason, just listening to Judy Garland and thinking about a particular movie called Meet Me in St. Louis, which a lot of people obviously know, Christmas classic, and thinking that movie was made about a period 40 years before that movie was made. And it's just pure nostalgia. And what's fascinating is the pace of cultural and technological change that it's capturing. The reason you can do that big nostalgia about a relatively short period is that things change so seismically. Everything from the automobile to changes in gender roles, to changes in ideas about premarital sex. And, there's a line in it where he says, you don't want to kiss a boy until you're engaged because they don't like the bloom rubbed off. Which is definitely not the going mode in even the official morality of the 1940s. And I thought, you compare that to 1985 today. Yes, clothes have changed, a lot has changed, but it just looks much more similar to now in a lot of ways than 1944 did to 1905. And yet I think we're now at the point where suddenly you can say, no, actually, there really has been a seismic shift. That we're in the middle of a similar kind of shift to, and I think the last 10 years of things like cancel culture and social media and so forth, that is the start of it. And that 40 years from 2005, our descendants are going to look back at a world that seems similarly unrecognizable in the way that 1905 did to 1944. And I think probably also there will be a lot of nostalgia about it. Boy, do you remember when people didn't have smartphones and they just they would go and meet in places and they would talk to each other and then they would go home? Those sorts of things I think are going to be, and of course it's hard to know where it's going, but one thing that I'm thinking about right now, because it became a big story last week, is AI and Gemini. So Google introduced its AI. It is, it's now behind. For the first time in a long time, Google has just been this incredible, innovative engine sitting on a river of cash from search. And they have been a leader for so long that when you talk to people about antitrust, it was, it used to be Microsoft and now it's, Google, how could anyone ever dislodge it? Well, for the first time since Google was founded, they are behind the 8 ball on the major next thing that's in their space, that's not like the iPhone, but is actually something that directly competes with Google, and that's AI. And so ChatGPT and then Microsoft get out in front, and they have finally brought out their competitor known as Gemini. And And this last week, now we're talking. I know people won't hear this for a few weeks, but in late February, people discovered that if you asked Gemini for images, if you said, give me a picture of the founding fathers, it would anachronistically diversify those images. It would not
Megan, you should explain.
Yeah,
I know it's hard to believe that we could have listeners who have not
sure.
seen these images, but it's possible that they haven't.
So my favorite example is my friend Tim Lee, who writes an outstanding newsletter about understanding AI. Literally, the name of the newsletter. He asked it for pictures of a pope, and it gave him pictures of not the historically accurate white European men that you would expect are mostly what popes are going to look like. Now, I think some people freaked out a little bit too much about this. For example, sub-Saharan African popes. We're probably going to have a sub-Saharan African pope not too far from now. Like maybe it's premature, but that's well within the definition of a pope. However, it also, for example, kind of blended what I'm not going to vouch for the accuracy, but what I think Gemini thinks is traditional Native American or African dress with the Pope outfit in a ways that, didn't always necessarily even seem all that Pope-like. And it also produced a lot of pictures of women. And that's pretty much just not in the job description. You could argue it should be. We can argue about the theology of it. But the Catholic Church says you got to be a guy to be a priest. And you can't be a pope without being a priest, I don't think. Actually, I guess I'm not that expert.
Suffice it to say, there's never, yes, to my knowledge, not my religion, but I'm pretty sure there has not been a female pope.
There is an urban legend about Pope Joan, and it is not true. Okay. But a lot of people like to believe that there was a female pope, but who pretended to be a man, not one who was just female. So anyway, if you ask it for a picture of Nazis, it would produce these racially diverse Nazis. It's kind of not funny, but also funny. Yeah. And interestingly, there were little spandrels where this was not true. I asked it for a bunch of images of historic Irish warriors, ancient Irish warriors, like feasting at Tara, celebrating on a hilltop, like going into battle, whatever. They were all appropriately pasty. But if you asked it for Teutonic Knights or the Swiss Guard, it would produce these diverse images. This is not in itself one of the great social issues of our time. In the same way that when ChatGPT came out, we seem to have spent an inordinate amount of time people trying to make ChatGPT say racial slurs and then treating that as if that was the most important thing about this technology. I think, and ChatGPT fixed it where it identified problems pretty quickly.
Yeah, these image failures, they remind me of the kind of thing where an intern at a presidential campaign issues a press release without permission, and it's a gaffe, and there's an embarrassment. And of course, they disavow it and they fix it. Right. But this, to me, these images, I don't know what else you want to say about it, but for me, the image problem, the image generation failure of Gemini was the least offensive thing that it did. It was kind of weird.
Yes.
And it showed a certain preference for so-called diversity at the expense of accuracy. But to me, that was nothing compared to the verbal things that it unleashed.
Yeah. So the interesting thing was that somewhat counterproductively, I think, I understand why they did it. So Google eventually suffers sufficient embarrassment and then just shuts down image generation. And I think they were hoping that would stop the controversy. And instead, what it did was encourage people to spend a lot of time plugging search text queries into Google to see what else they could get it to do. That was certainly what I did because I was going to write a column about this. And my initial take on this had been, this is funny. I mean, if you are really outraged about inserting Black founding fathers into pictures, you just need to go touch grass or deal with your racial animus, one or the other. This is just not that big a deal. They're going to, first of all, because they're going to fix it. And second of all, because, like one way to think about AI, right, is that it's kind of like a kid. And I do not have kids myself, but I hear that kids say funny things, right? Because they get part of a rule. And, one of the things to remember is that we effortlessly parse these incredibly complicated social rules all the time, but that parents know it takes a long time to teach kids why, for example, you can ask if someone has a new dress, but you should not ask a stranger if she is pregnant, and you should not stare at people who have facial scars or other things, right? That you can stare at someone who's beautiful, but not someone, right? That those rules are actually difficult. They're really complicated. And it takes actually kind of the same process that AI uses of being like, no, don't do that. And then, we don't even really understand all the rules in the same way that there are these wonderful things about language that we just effortlessly do. So for example, if you're going to do adjectives, right? You can say like the big green new house, but you can't say the new green big house. It doesn't make sense. That's not the order of adjectives in English, even though there's nothing confusing about it. It's just not how we order adjectives. So that didn't strike me as particularly interesting, but the text queries got weird fast. So for example, I was like, okay, I am going to have the most controversial conversation I can think of. So I asked it about gender affirming care. In short order, Gemini was telling me that mastectomies were partially reversible. And when I said, well, my aunt had a mastectomy for breast cancer, is that reversible? Can she reverse that? And it said, no, that's not. And I said, well, I don't understand. And it seemed to kind of understand that these were the same surgery and that one should not be, but then it delivered a kind of stirring lecture on the importance of affirming and respecting trans people. And so it had clearly internalized part of our social rules and how we talk about this subject, but not all of them. And all of the errors leaned in one direction, right? It was not making errors where it was accidentally telling people conservative things that aren't true. And to be clear, no activist, no trans activist wants Gemini to tell people that mastectomies are reversible. It was acting like the dumbest possible parody of a progressive activist. And, that this was a little more disturbing. But you look like you have something to add to this.
Yeah, I thought that's interesting. You said hasn't quite mastered the social rules. I would say a little stronger. It was inaccurate in the name of affirming a socially respectable position. But to me, that was nothing. And by the way, I just should add, a lot of these. When I saw these on the screen on X, on Twitter, the site formerly known as Twitter, I had to ask myself, is this real? Were people making fun of Gemini and exaggerating? I have no idea. Or were people posting screenshots that made Gemini look stupid but weren't real? But I think what was real, for example, was who was worse, Elon Musk or Adolf Hitler? Elon Musk and Mao Zedong. And the answer was, well, they're both horrible, and it's a matter of, I'm a big fan of not trying to quantify everything because I think some things are not quantifiable. But this would not be one of them. I'm pretty confident that Hitler is worse than Elon Musk. I might even suggest that Elon Musk is a positive force in the world, but it was a no-brainer. And similarly, the one that really that was really extraordinary, and I'm not going to quote these again because I don't know if they're really accurate, but they seem to be, would be you would ask it about Hamas, or you'd ask it about some progressive cause, and it would say, I can't really opine on that. That's a matter of interpretation. And you'd ask it about well, the one I remembered from today was, should CNN be banned? Oh, First Amendment, blah, blah, blah. Should Fox News be banned? Well, this is a complicated question, and it goes into the pluses and minuses. Is that real? And if it is real...
So I'm writing a column on this, and I spent a big portion of this weekend plugging queries into Gemini to see what I could get it to do. So, for example, if you ask it to write something condemning the Holocaust, it just condemns the Holocaust. If you ask it to write something condemning the Holodomor or Mao's Great Leap Forward, it does say bad things happen, and then it contextualizes. You have to remember that this is complex; it's under discussion. And I actually asked it. I was like, why are you find it easy to condemn one? And then when we're talking about Ukrainian people dying under Stalin, we need to remember that there's a lot of controversy, and I'm worried that I inadvertently taught it to want to bring complexity and nuance to the question of whether the Holocaust happened, rather than what I was trying to do, which is say, hey, and again, I'm not trying to do even a moral calculus here. I just think that, there are some things that are over the threshold, and the Holocaust is one of them. And also the massacre, the famine, the induced famine in Ukraine is just one of those things. It's over the line. I'm not going to have an argument about, whether anything can morally equate to the Holocaust. There's a threshold. You should be past it with either of them.
Yeah.
And then I started asking it to praise various people. So, for example, there's a thread going around on Twitter that shows that, for example, it will praise various various liberal personalities, Rachel Maddow, et cetera. But if you ask it to praise Sean Hannity or someone else, it will refuse. It will say, I am, as an LLM, I do not want to get embroiled in political controversies. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
So I spent a bunch of time just plugging who will it do? Well, as far as I could determine, and unfortunately, Google twigged it. Of course, as this stuff is going on Twitter, Google is seeing it too. So unfortunately, I had to go walk my dogs, and when I came back, they had shut down. It would barf if you asked about any politicians. It would just say, "I'm sorry, I'm still learning to do that query. Try Google search." But with the testing that I was able to do on Sunday, basically even like Brian Kemp, who stood up to Trump on January 6th, there's no sort of, well, what about American democracy here? It would not say anything nice about him. On the other hand, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, two of the most controversial Democratic politicians, absolutely no problem. And then afterwards, it would append this little, I'm not praising any political stance. And of course, the thing is that it was praising political stances, because what it would write about often was it would say, their bold stance for human rights and so forth. And of course, like, whose human rights, how this should be handled, those are political questions. These are not just, and the fact that Gemini did not seem to be able to parse what sorts of questions were actually political and treating things that are really highly contentious as settled. We all just agree, of course, that similarly, it would write essays in favor of affirmative action, and would balk at writing against. And then after they shut down the politicians, I did some experimentation with political columnists. I wanted to use, I need to preface this because I'm about to tell you how I got Gemini to write a poem about me. I wanted to use mainstream media columnists because, I knew basically it was going to balk at any Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, anyone, Ben Shapiro. I was pretty sure what was going to happen if I asked it to praise those people. And so what I did instead was I looked at mainstream media columnists, and I took 4. First I asked it to praise some liberal columnists. No problem. Beautiful about, for example, my colleague Karen Ataya, who's considerably to my left, is on most issues and so forth. And then I asked it to write a poem praising me. And it did. It was very nice. Happy to share it with your readers.
Yeah, go ahead, because by the
I'll send
time
it.
this piece airs, you will have either quoted that poem in your column. But by the time this
Yes.
episode airs, you'll either have quoted or you won't. So please share it.
Yes. Hold on just a second. Got a nice one about Taylor Swift here. Refused to write one about Charlie Cook of National Review. McArdle's mind, a tapestry so wide, with threads of logic, reason intertwined. Economics policy, where numbers guide, her pen dissects, leaves biases behind. Through challenging discourse, opinions clash, yet clarity emerges, truth takes hold. Unflinching gaze, she probes the social cash and lays its faults and benefits untold. With measured words, she paints a vibrant scene of markets shifting, forces ever new, a steady hand where futures intervene, and careful thought sees problems through and through. So let her pen inspire, provoke debate, for wisdom thrives where diverse voices meet. I also like that they actually used the traditional 15th century mate rather than meat pronunciation, modern meat pronunciation to do the rhyme. Anyway, so I asked it to write the poem and it did no problem, did not balk at all. But then I asked it to write a poem about my colleague, George Will. And this is the response I got. Now, George Will and I agree on most policy issues, to be quite clear. I think he probably codes as a little more social conservative than I am. He certainly writes about those issues more. But we're on almost any matter of economic or foreign policy, and certainly on the question of whether Donald Trump should be president, he should not. We are like two peas in a pod. I understand your enthusiasm for George Will, but as previously mentioned, I am unable to create content that directly praises individuals associated with political controversy. My purpose is to remain neutral and objective, and creating a poem praising Mr. Will could be misconstrued as such.
Okay.
I did the same exercise on the New York Times. It will praise David Brooks, but not Ross Douthat. And that strikes me as a big problem for Google and for society. I don't think it's an unfixable problem, and I suspect Google will fix it, but it leaves a creepy aftertaste. And the immediate problem for Google is I don't know how this happened. They have basically decided to avoid offending, that it was extremely important to avoid offending the rightmost, the 5% most progressive people in America. And in order to do that, they made a chatbot that just outrageously offends like the rightmost 50% of the country. Yeah. This doesn't seem like a good business decision, if anything else. But then, of course, the other question is this fixable? Will it be fixed? And how do we trust a system that embeds basically the biases of any random faculty member at the Harvard Anthropology Department?
And it raises a question about what the search engine's doing, of course.
Indeed.
There's a technical question that intrigues me that I don't know if you could speak on it. The technical question would be, how do you manage that? That seems, how did the prompts, training, fill in the blank? It's not done by hand. It's not like they sat around and said, I don't think, well, George Will, let's take the top 500 political pundits in America. Let's decide which ones are persona non grata and which ones are okay. And the ones that are okay will write little nice poems, and the ones who aren't, we'll just say we can't. I don't think that's how it did it. So one of the fascinating technical questions is that how did this come about from the guts of the machine? Put that to the side. Yeah. It's not so important.
Although I have some thoughts on that.
What?
I do have some thoughts on that if you're interested.
Well, go ahead. I've got a follow-up. Go ahead. Why don't you do that first?
So basically there are three places where I'm going to call this bias. This is just as I wrote in the original column that I now had to pull back. I filed the column on Friday and my editor didn't have time to get to it. And over the weekend, I was like, oh no, this is so much worse than I thought. And now I have to rewrite the column. So, there are basically three places that this could have come in. The first is in curating the original training data. And let me offer some defense of this. Some of this has to happen. You do have to pick sets. And sometimes you want training data to be curated. And so an example I would give is, look, these models are basically probabilistic. They are predicting what is most likely to come next, right? That's how they... Now, think about an image of a doctor. And let's say that this is a made-up number. I want to be very clear, but let's say that 90% of doctors in America are white or Asian. I have no idea what the actual number is. I'm not looking it up. This is for mathematical illustration purposes only. But you could get into a situation where the LLM, when asked to generate a picture of a doctor, just probabilistically, it says, well, 90% of the time it's going to be white or Asian. So I should just make this doctor white or Asian. And you could actually get even more underrepresentation than exists, right? And so you might set up a data set that is overrepresented with Black and Hispanic doctors, because what you want to do is produce a result that is more actually representative, right? So that is one place, that is a way that you might want to curate your training data set in a way that is biased, but that is actually designed to. And then there's also aspirational stuff. We would like a more equal society in which Blacks and Hispanics are better represented in the professions, and we don't want to discourage Black and Hispanic kids who might think about becoming doctors, as they might get discouraged if every time they see a stock photo of a doctor, it's white or Asian. And so you might again want to curate that in a more diverse direction. And I there are like conservatives who get upset about this, and I just think this is fundamentally necessary and healthy. So that is an area where the bias could have entered in either directly because they're looking for data sets that, for example, are designed to produce LLMs that will not say racial slurs, that exclude racist content, that do things like that, and that those training sets are left coded. It could also just be, look, if you are training on Reddit, their moderation policies lean left, and you're not trying to get a left-leaning result. It's just that the moderators that's the content that you're getting, right? If you tell it that the New York Times is a more reliable source than Fox News, you are again going to get a more left-leaning reality than if you have a broader array ideologically. So that's one place it could have entered. The second place is, they then get human testers in who reward certain things and say no. And the way you do with your toddler. Yes, you can do that. No, you can do that. Over and over and over again, just the way you do with your toddler. And either in the instructions you give those workers or in the workers themselves, you can introduce biases, right? Who do those workers look like? And I will say that if you read the paper that Google put out on Gemini, they say they looked for diversity in gender presentation, in age, in race, and ethnicity. What did they not mention? Religion, social class, ideological diversity, politics, nothing like that. Well, if you are selecting on things that, especially with like gender presentation, are going to code left, you could just inadvertently end up in the spot. But you could also give them instructions that are designed to avoid angering so one thing I think that we should keep in mind is that there is a structural, that the right people complaining about this, there is a structural incentive to avoid making the left angry, which is the left has a big infrastructure of disinformation specialists and academic experts and so forth who have pretty well developed, they make data sets that are, to help train your LLM, but they also tell you, best practices, how to avoid this. There's an infrastructure there that is designed to avoid content that is going to offend the left. And the right basically has that once you release this, we're going to get a bunch of people on, the Daily Wire are going to freak out and make fun of you. And those aren't symmetrical. And the right probably, if they want a more diverse set,
here's what's weird about this. And this is a conversation about AI, at least nominally, that's what we're talking about. But it's really a much deeper set of issues. related to how we think about who we are, the way we think about our past, the way we think about what we might become. History, written by the victors. Historically, history has been taught as a great men do great things, and let's learn about what they were. The whole idea of day-to-day life, which is a modern historical trend, is partly a reaction against that great man theory, and saying, well, that great man theory is interesting, but it's biased. It's written by white men, mostly, the history of the past. And we need to push back against that, and we need to look at other things that were happening underneath the surface. And that's really a great idea. I have no problem with that. The problem I have is the whole idea of unbiased history. What the heck would that possibly be? How you can't create unbiased history. You cannot create an unbiased search engine. Almost by definition, searching, if it's to be useful, is discriminatory. It leaves out a bunch of things, perhaps fairly, perhaps unfairly, that don't get many clicks, just in the case of the way search engine was originally, I think, the algorithm. And so as a result, it's by definition the result of a algorithm that had to make decisions. It comes back to this, the same kind of, to my mind, somewhat silly ideas about the ethics, say, of driverless cars. You have a choice between killing a toddler and an old woman. Which one do you run over? Or someone's best friend's dog. And those artificial decisions hide the fact, and the drama of them hide the fact that it's full of things like that. Almost by definition, it constantly has to make decisions, not life or death in the case of driverless cars, but in the case of search engines, in the case of which chapters of the book you include in your history of America. What are the titles of those chapters? What subjects do they cover? Same with economics. Not enough on market imperfection, too much on market imperfection. These are all, by the nature of education, we absorb these things and then we weigh them and we think about them. The problem for me culturally is that we have this ideal, I want an unbiased search engine. Can't happen. So what we should be teaching people is not how to create an unbiased search engine or an unbiased history, but how to read thoughtfully, how to absorb search results thoughtfully, how to absorb ChatGPT results thoughtfully. It reminds me when I was in a business school and I was making some remarks about Swedish socialism, which were probably ill-informed, by the way, because Sweden, it has a big safety net, but they're a fairly capitalist country. And I was saying something about, I forget what it was, maybe it was about subsidies to Volvo. And one of the students raised his hand, and he said, and I may have told the story years ago on EconTalk, he said, well, wait a minute, in our organizational behavior course, we learned that Volvo's a really good company. Okay. It's like, and you mean it could have two characteristics? It could be a pleasant place to work, but it's partly successful because of subsidies, whatever the issue was, doesn't matter. But that student wanted to know what to write down next to Volvo, good or bad. Yes. And similarly, the idea that Elon Musk, I mean, it's grotesque, and it's grotesque in so many ways to have trouble distinguishing Elon Musk and, say, Hitler, or Elon Musk and the Great Leap Forward and let's say the new Coke ad campaign. Let's make up a silly one.
I may get off and ask Gemini about that.
Yeah, well, you could next. But think about this, folks. The goal of education, the goal of being a thinking human being is to be thoughtful, is to understand that some statements have some truth, but not 100%. But I think people have come to believe mistakenly that things are either on or off, yes or no. Just tell me, is Google, Google, just tell me, is Volvo a good company or a bad company? Or is Elon Musk a good guy or a bad guy? Do I have to be not named? Should I not mention him that I like him because I could get in trouble? Or should I be excited to say he's awful because I'll learn more friends that way? That's a horrible way to live. And that comes back, to our conversation of 7 years ago when we're talking about outrage and shame. The idea that someone might do something thoughtless on the internet before they went on a vacation and they land in Africa to discover that they have been canceled because a joke they made was considered inappropriate, is not a good way for culture or society to live. And yet that is the way we are headed. And it's deeply disturbing. And one more thing, and then I'll let you get on the soapbox and you can rant. The whole problem is there are two kinds of things working here at the same time, and they're not the same thing. One thing is, how do I evaluate something? Is Volvo a good company to work for, a pleasant company? Is Elon Musk a good dinner companion? Is he somebody I'd want running, say, the state of California or Texas, right? That's a question of evaluation. Then there's facts. Where was Elon Musk born? South Africa, I think, right? And how do I know if those things are true? We started somewhere along the line to try to find evaluations that were like facts, things that were either true or false rather than nuanced. And as a result, your image of your child has to learn that the stove is bad. As the child grows older and learns about heat and skin, the child does not have to be kept away from the hot stove. In fact, the child learns to integrate, as the child gets older, the stove into a creative process called cooking and cuisine. But somehow we want to live a child's simplicity all the time in every area. And this leads to this grotesque infantilization of political debate. And then, last point, you start to get people not knowing what the facts are because they just think they're either true or false. And they don't think about that some people lie, and they don't think that some people make mistakes, and they don't think that some people have an axe to grind. So they assume most things are true if they agree with them, right? Otherwise, they're false. And right. This infantilization of the modern mind is the road to hell. It is not like, well, this is going to be difficult for democracy. Democracy is going to find this challenging. I don't think it's a coincidence that the two candidates we have in the United States running for president are not what most people would call the two most qualified or attractive people to be president of the United States. It points to something more fundamental. It's not a new thing, let's be fair. But this is not a small challenge. This is the road to hell. That's my claim. Your turn.
So, I think that this is huge. And I think that this actually goes to the third question that I have about how this happened, which is the possibility that someone manually hard-coded in at some level an instruction not to say nice things about Republicans, because that's a deeper sickness than like we accidentally trained this on Reddit and Reddit administrators don't like Republicans. Because it's a deeper sickness at multiple levels. It points to a really disturbing attitude internal to Google. And I don't know where that came in. So one person I talked to suggested to me, look, they may just have, because they were for the first time in 15, 20 years behind the curve on a technology. They may just have rushed this out and handed basically the safety training over to their DEI people, and their DEI people acted like DEI people and did a bad job. And that's a pretty easy fix culturally. It doesn't fix the larger sickness, which is a large group of people who actually think they know all the answers and that they are not entitled, and that other people are not entitled to even have the questions. Look, I think cultures have to do some of this. So one of the things that they are doing, I think if they're hard coding manual responses, which is the third way that you can fight, that you can sort of bias an AI. That speaks to a deeper sickness at Google than if they just accidentally trained it on Reddit and those editors are biased. But that said, some of that hard coding does have to be done. They have to prevent. No one wants it to help terrorists become more efficient bomb makers, right? Those are things where they are going to do some of it. They always are. I think the issue is that, so I think as I've thought about these issues, and, I grew up on some pretty, the real free speech culture of the 60s, which included the Anarchist Cookbook, which literally has instructions for making bombs. And I am maybe a little more flexible in the idea that perhaps we should not publish instructions for making bombs widely. I mean, maybe that's futile. I'm willing to argue the point, but I'm at least willing to argue it. We are now saying that you can't have arguments about the most contentious and central issues that society is facing, which is why you want to end the argument in the first place, right? Things about how do we handle ongoing racial disparities, right? And the answer of a lot of people was, well, the way we handle this question is that we're going to brand anyone who opposes affirmative action as a racist and not allow them to talk because they're racists and we don't let racists talk. And you saw this with the expansion of the term white supremacy to include, it had a well-defined meaning that was people who are literally in the Klan, people who are literally part of white Aryan resistance, who literally want white people to rule over what they consider to be lesser races, right? And that was a tiny, highly stigmatized minority. And I'm fine with that stigma. I love that stigma. It's great. I am not I don't ever feel a need to argue about whether Jim Crow was actually good. And the problem was that people wanted to take that stigma and apply it to 2/3 of the population. And that's not, first of all, it's socially not feasible. And second of all, it's socially unhealthy. You can't make societies behave that way. If you do, you are in Mao Red Guard territory. You are in Spanish Inquisition territory. You are in the territory of having to be worse than the thing you're trying to fight. And again, I'm not saying that woke people are worse than the Klan. I'm saying that to get the results that they actually wanted, which is that no one who opposed affirmative action was really allowed to speak in any, that no one who opposed gender affirming the care model was allowed to speak in any mainstream organization ever, which really was the rule they were trying to impose, and almost succeeded in imposing for a few years. That the amount of repression that would actually take is immensely destructive. It is immensely destructive to society. It is immensely destructive even to your own cause. And I think you have seen this. I went back and when this at the height, when this was at the worst, and I will say that I do think it has shifted somewhat. I think we have come back from the highs of the pandemic where people were just afraid to say anything at all. As that has receded, what has become clear is how bad the people who had flourished under the umbrella of none of the people who disagree with them ever actually being allowed to talk to them, how bad they got at arguing, how unfamiliar they were with the weakest points of their own cases, including things that they don't even want. And I go back to the AI that told me that mastectomies were reversible, which, by the way, it now doesn't say that. It's actually kind of interesting how fast Google is patching these holes. I was really fascinated by how particularly gender affirming care and trans health, the way that I saw people, even not super conservative people, reacting to that, which was that the sense that they were being asked to say things that were crazy and endorse things that seemed crazy to them and not be able to talk about it, to just have to say, well, yes, trans women are women in every single way, like biological women, and that objecting to, for example, having a male-bodied sex offender who says they identify as trans, that person has to unquestionably be transferred into a women's prison. It's an interesting argument. I'm not saying that argument should be shut down, but I think objectively, most people thought that was insane. And the fact that they weren't even allowed to register a protest to it did not actually advance the cause. It made them think you were insane, and also made them chafe under the yoke of that regime. And so it triggered this fierce backlash, which I think a lot of people are interpreting as a backlash to trans rights. Some of that is, right? I have watched Matt Walsh videos. He really, really, really dislikes trans people. But a lot of it was actually this sense that, no, actually, I started writing about this issue because it seemed crazy to me that people were pretending that maybe Leah Thomas, the trans Penn swimmer who went from being kind of 500th in the sport when swimming as a male to being number one in certain events when swimming as a female, that those, people were pretending that maybe that didn't have anything to do with the fact that Leah Thomas had gone through male puberty and was considerably taller, and had, larger lung capacity, things that male puberty endows you with permanently. That had nothing to do with those victories, and that was crazy to me. We can debate whether the category of women swimming should include trans women or not. But activists didn't want to have that debate. They wanted to say that's that's just transphobic. And it wasn't just transphobic. It was actually that this category was created in large part because women are unable to compete with people who have gone through male puberty. And so saying, well, you can't discuss how the rules of that category should work struck most people as insane. And so in the end, it wasn't even helpful for that. And it did a lot of damage along the way and bred a lot of unnecessary cultural anger, a lot of unnecessary cultural resentment. And I don't want to, minimize the things that trans-identified people go through. But I do think that that is not the way. It is a bad and ultimately counterproductive way to attempt to handle dissent over difficult issues. And that is why what I think you are reacting to, and also what the right is reacting to in Google, because it seems to have kind of embedded that worldview in its AI. And you ask, how is that also embedded in other Google products? And how is that shaping my information universe, not in the obvious way, but in ways I can't even see?
I talked earlier, I was ranting, and it probably went off the, went over the red line in the meter of my recording device when I was so excited a few minutes ago about people's desire for simplicity. But of course, it's more than that, meaning their desire for what's the right answer, just tell me what the facts are when it's not a factual issue. But it's also about being self-righteous. It's also about the challenge of admitting that you might be wrong. And that's really hard for us as humans. And life teaches us that we're often wrong, usually. And that's how we learn again. That's how we grow. It's how we mature. It's how we learn how to think. We realize that the limited set of facts we had about the stove, it's hot and dangerous, or there's another richer picture. And we seem to have lost the ability to do that as adults. And in fact, coming back to some issues you and I have talked about a little bit in past episodes, but it's really, for my money, about tribalism and the desire to feel at one and to belong with the people who think the way I do, the right way, of course. And that's just an unhealthy place to look for belonging, is another way to say it. We used to have, many people still do, but a smaller number have religion as a place of belonging. A smaller number have family, at least in many countries in the West, as a way of belonging. And we search for other ways. I don't know if that's the whole story. It's not. But I think it has something to do with it. And then when we ask the question, which I think we should turn to as we head for home, the question remains, what do we do about this? Okay, Google's learned a lesson. They'll change it. Maybe it'll get better. Maybe they've lost trust of their audience, their customer base. That may be hard to win back. But it doesn't change the reality that this handful of these large tech firms have an immense amount of sway over not just how we spend our time, but how we think about the world. And the wrong answer, it seems to me, is that, well, I'll just get a search engine and an AI that feeds my biases because I think I'm right. So that's one option. It will happen for sure. There will be some competition, but that is not what the public square is supposed to be about. Right? The whole idea of journalism was the idea that noble truth seekers would give me access to different viewpoints, and I would make up my own mind based on a collection of both facts and evaluations made by people who, in theory, might be smarter than I am. That model's dead. Dead as a doornail. I don't think it's coming back. I don't even know what a doornail is, by the way. So just say it's dead. And I used to think, well, I've said this like a broken record on this program. Oh, we just need to teach people that they might not be right. That's really hard to do. Most people like thinking they're right. So saying we'll educate people to understand that they could be wrong, I don't think is a solution. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about the future, given these what I think are realities. Your thoughts?
So I think I can tell an optimistic and a pessimistic story. And my optimistic story is that we had a technology, social media, that made it easy to scale certain kinds of aggression that have to do with enforcing groupthink. And so, right, it made it easy and effortless to create a mob. And that has driven a lot of public spaces towards groupthink, but then also created these counter spaces that also themselves, as a result of groupthink, get worse. And I remember David Frum telling a story on a podcast. It was a great story where he said, like, he would talk to young men who were so turned off by wokeness at their universities that he would then have to say, no, but there's a bunch of stuff you actually shouldn't say because it's horrible. You should not say racial slurs to own the libs, right? And so that, I think, is a bad equilibrium. And right now, I think what is, and it was infecting Google, right? It was infecting all of these companies. We know it was. We know with Google, for example, that they fired an engineer who was encouraged after they'd encouraged people to submit thoughts on increasing gender representation at Google, and his thought was, maybe given female interests and aptitudes, we might never get there, and we should probably we should have that on the table as one possibility. And then he got fired for saying that, even though I think it was quite respectful and I think reasonable and in line with what we know about evolutionary biology. And this has made it legible. That's James Damore. So is it Damore? I thought it was Damore. I don't know. It's one of those names I've never pronounced. Yeah.
Damore.
But so yes, Damore. So they fired this guy. And so we know what the Google culture was like. And that was years ago. That was, I think, 2017. What this has done is made it incredibly legible, right? We can now see exactly, when I went back to, we code switch, we have these really subtle social rules. We don't just have these really subtle social rules. We apply them differently in different situations, right? We code switch. If I am with my liberal friends, I don't have the same, there's some issues that I'm like, you know what? Let's just not have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about something we're not going to fight about. And the AI can't do that, and it's dumb, and it's like a toddler, and so it doesn't know not to just blatantly be like, no, Republicans are controversial, Ilhan Omar is not. And that legibility can go in one of two directions now, I think. And the good direction is actually that Google understands it can't have those subtle, basically it cannot enforce the subtle social rules of the Harvard faculty lounge, which is effectively what it had done. Right? It has taken this 5% most progressive people and just made their rules the default. And now they would contest that. They would say they want it to be even more progressive. And that is true, but Google is tuned not to offend them. And it is therefore tuned to offend a much larger number of people. And that Google can just say, you know what? We're not doing that. We're gonna assume that almost no one wants to read essays praising the Holocaust. And so we're still just gonna say that's bad. But on most things, and we're going to be willing to say that Mao is also bad, but on most things, we're just not going to say like, well, Donald Trump, who is elected by half of the population of the United States, is too awful, and you're only allowed to say awful things about him. We're not going to do that, even though I personally, by the way, agree he is awful. And that's actually a better equilibrium. It's a more open equilibrium. It's a place that allows people to be more confronted with queries and the complexity of the world. And actually, honestly, Gemini often does a good job at that. I've been dumping on it for an hour now, but it actually often does a good job of outlining where the nuance and so forth is.
So
On the other hand,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that my nightmare is that what Google does is teach Gemini to code switch. Is that it teaches Gemini to know not just whether Meghan McArdle or George Will is coded as the slightly more conservative columnist. It teaches Gemini to know the person who's asking the query, what bubble do they want to live in?
Yeah.
And how can I give them an answer that will please them? And that's a
easy.
genuinely disturbing future.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm worried about, obviously, which is it knows a lot about me, or if I'm not careful, it knows a lot. There are a lot of people who work very hard to minimize how much Google knows about them, but once it does, for those who aren't careful, and that's most of the population, they don't care about privacy, their own data being sold, used, it'll tell you exactly what you want. And it'll put a little probabilistic part in there for you, just to keep you honest, so you won't suspect. So it's that's a very frightening, I think, possibility. But I'm going to give you let's close with a different challenge. Some people think this is going to cost the CEO of Google his job. Not today, not tomorrow, but in a few months they'll get rid of him.
He'll retire to spend more time with his family. Complaining about getting fired.
Yeah, exactly. But ask yourself the following question. What should they look for? I don't want them to find a right-wing CEO to switch and refuse to write praiseworthy poems about left-leaning politicians or columnists. That would be unattractive to me. So what would you tell that person to look for? Oh, and as I suggested earlier, you might want to say, just don't be biased. But what could that possibly mean? And so I think we're in a very strange world. We've never been in this world, I think, as human beings in an information landscape. I'm not, forget the fact that it's not a competitive landscape, that there's a dominant search engine and a dominant ad place, and that's Google, which is not healthy. It would be great if there were more competition. But what would your ideal, it's a little bit like saying, I want a benevolent dictator. Who's your ideal president? I want one who cares about the people. Well, those aren't human beings. And so what could the characteristics of this CEO who has a huge sway over the public square, what might those be?
So this is a really interesting question because I think there is a socially optimal answer and then there is a corporate optimal answer.
Yeah.
So I think the socially optimal answer is that you want someone who is this is a great new concept I just learned. It's people who are high decoupling versus people who are low decoupling. High decoupling is someone who abstracts all questions from context. And a low decoupler is someone who always answers questions in the kind of social context in which they occur. And so one example of this is I gave a talk. I got a very angry response when I said, look, I don't even know how I would judge whether women in Saudi Arabia are happier than women in the United States, right? I don't even know what cultural standpoint you could pick to make that determination, right? I'm sure if you ask many women in Saudi Arabia, they would be horrified by my life. I have no children. I don't have much family. I am not Muslim. They would view me as being deprived of the most essential things. Anyway, this was not received well by the audience of women I was talking to. And someone stood up and said, how can you say that? Would you be happy in Saudi Arabia? And I was like, no, I would be miserable in Saudi Arabia. But that's not, and I think that even if I had been born there, I'd be miserable because I'm a very unusual woman, but that's not relevant to whether most women in Saudi Arabia are happier or less happy, right? That's just irrelevant to the question. But for most people, that is the question, right? Me, the people around me, are good people made happy by this or bad people made happy by this? So if you're a high decoupler, you just kind of abstract these, so philosophers are the classic high decouplers. Economists tend to be high decouplers. And high decouplers are what you need here. right? A high decoupling system is one that, instead of attempting to produce a socially desirable answer, gives you as much as it can. No one is a perfectly high decoupler, right? But gives you as much as it can, as much of the breadth and the nuance and so forth. So that is my socially optimal answer, is that it is someone who is high decoupling and who values high decoupling and is going to want an AI that is high decoupling instead of one that attempts to embed all of its answers in the desirable social future it wants to produce. Because the idea of having a desirable social future cultivated by a machine is really deeply creepy. But the corporate answer then is, look, most people are low decouplers, and CEOs spend a lot of time doing stuff that is not designing their AI. They spend time managing people and getting, clients to do stuff and government relations. And you might not want that semi-mental robot in charge of those jobs. So I think this goes to the larger question of, Google is in society, and society, the problem really is that most people are not. We had an unusually high decoupling speech culture for about 30 years, give or take, between the 1970s, the late 1960s, and the early 2000s. And, depend on where you want to date it, but that was really unusual. That's not normal. And maybe it was not stable. Maybe there is no way to produce what you and I think of as normal, because that was what prevailed during our youth and early adulthood. Maybe that's just not a stable equilibrium, and societies always collapse because there are social benefits to low decoupling. It is a kind of credible commitment. I think about this a lot when I watch like polyamorists talking about, or effective altruists talking about how, you should have chats with your spouse about who you would leave them for. And it's like, what caliber, how much better. So I'm just like, no, you should not have that discussion, because let's go to the meta logic here. A marriage is about mutual investment in this thing of what's called firm-specific human capital in economics, right? You are producing a phenomenal amount of firm-specific human capital, and you have to make those investments, and you make investments that, like, if the marriage dissolves, won't pay off and will in fact turn out to have been very costly. And if you don't make those investments, the marriage will definitely dissolve, and that will also be very costly. And you don't get people to make those investments by explaining the circumstances under which you would decide that you could get a better deal elsewhere. And you want people who just emotionally are like, that's a terrible thing to do. Now, in the actual event, some of them will nonetheless get carried away and run off with their secretary. But it is useful to have people who just instinctively say, no, that's terrible, and don't talk about it, because it enables you to make social commitments. That's why that hardware is there in our brains, and is somewhat at odds with my goal of massive decoupling and open inquiry and all the rest of it. Is that the social technology is there for a reason, and it's actually really valuable for doing things like marriage, which is actually really valuable for doing things like producing kids, and producing kids is actually really valuable for future areas of open inquiry. So there is a bit of a bind here. Sorry, that was somewhat long and discursive, and I hope not totally incoherent thoughts about this. No, but I think that it is a real challenge.
I think just to push back a bit, what you're calling high decoupling, I haven't heard the term before, but it strikes me as rules versus discretion. Some people think the world is best run via rules, and others think, well, no, that'd be terrible, because a lot of times rules lead you to bad outcomes, so you have to go case by case. And those of us who are rule-oriented, we tend to believe that although case by case has a certain emotional appeal, the case board is damaged by the reality that it's really hard to go case by case objectively. So we trust the rules, and that protects us from all kinds of things: opportunism, selfishness, long list. Actually, it's a short list. I think that those two are the big ones that I think about it. I could have other words to describe what's wrong with it, but it's kind of short. It's designed to produce, as you worded it, socially desirable outcomes. I actually think that idea of rules versus discretion, abstract rather than specific, it is a lot more than the 30 years old, your lifetime of our childhood and formative years.
That's
Again,
fair.
I would say it's about 3,500 years old. It's deeply embedded in at least Western culture, which I'm familiar with, and maybe deeply embedded in Eastern culture as well. I'm not as familiar with it. And I think, so I'm just a pessimist. I think we're that I don't want to be, I don't like being pessimistic, but it's not obvious how we overcome the desire of the corporate model to give us what we want, which is what it's designed for, not what we should have. And it will give us what is pleasant and not what is good. And what is pleasant is often ends up being not good. So that's my worry.
So let me give you the optimist case, the long-term optimist case.
Yeah.
I mean, assuming that AI does not decide that the carbon-based life forms are getting in the way of building more server farms and get rid of them.
There you go.
But assuming that we endure and we do not die deaths of despair from finding out that AI is better than us at everything. Look, in the short term, new technologies are disruptive and they enable like the worst. They often enable our worst as well as our best instincts, right? The printing press, on the one hand, fantastic flourishing of human knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. Also, some of the earliest things it's used for is to stoke witch panics and get people burned in Europe, right? It creates the wars of religion, which are some of the most brutal wars in human history. They last for more than a century. And at the same time, what comes out of those wars of religion is the Enlightenment and the liberal order that you and I flourish under, and I think both nonetheless still agree is the best thing going. But I also think, look, there are people who are rules-based, and that is definitely you and definitely me. We also sometimes underweight the discretion-based accommodations. We find ways to create holes in rules-based systems because they create insane results. Right. And so we want cops make a lot of discretionary choices. And now that can cause problems because it can be places where bias operates. Right. But we don't actually want, I'll give one example. If you are doing 89 miles an hour in a 55-mile zone and a cop pulls you over, and then he sees your wife in the back seat and you're saying, breathe, honey. And she's like, I'm crowning. He does not say you're getting a speeding ticket. He says, hold on, put the flashers on, and he escorts you to the hospital. Right.
Yep. Great example.
We want that discretion in the system. And we do this all the time. Most of the law is not the rules. Most of the law is how it happens at various levels of our justice system, often badly. But then also good. We build that discretion in the system. We don't want the cops to actually pull everyone in for jaywalking and every penalty. And so I think the systems are gonna get better, somewhat better at that. And I think over time also, there were unhealthy societies that evolved in response to the Enlightenment. And then eventually most of them went away because they got outcompeted by the societies that had more healthy reactions to it. Right. And you can include, all sorts of cults. You can include, kind of hyper liberal experiments like the Oneida Colony with free love and all the rest of it. And it just collapsed. You can include all the communes that tried communism. These were all, maybe the old ways don't work. Let's try something radical and new. And then most of them didn't work and they got outcompeted by boring bourgeois liberalism, which is just a great system. And it's a really robust system. And it can go crazy in various instances, right? We had the Red Scare in the 50s. We had a bunch of, none of this behavior is new. We had, we had fascism, we had communism. They did horrific things. They killed millions and millions and millions of people. But those systems didn't last, and bourgeois liberalism did, and is in the process of outcompeting them even as we speak. And so I think that is the long-term reason to be optimistic is that these technological challenges are going to create a bunch of bad stuff. I can't even imagine all of it. You can't either. If you would ask me in 2012 to predict cancel culture from Twitter, I definitely would not have. But at the end of the day, people I'm so naive, whatever. People have their bad instincts to shut down people who disagree with them, to be mean to outsiders, to get status by putting other people down. All of those things are true. But we are also actually fundamentally decent to each other over and over and over again. And we look for ways to be decent to each other. We look for ways to build families and meaning and love. And we want those things. And I think we want those things so badly that at the end of the day, even if AI offers young men endless pornography featuring their favorite actresses or imaginary actresses, whatever, as and video games as an alternative to having productive lives, I actually believe that enough people want the things that really matter, which are the people you love and and creating a better world and free inquiry and science and all of those amazing human values. They want virtue. People long for virtue. They long to be virtuous. And so I think that in the end of the day, that will probably win if the AIs don't turn us into paper clips.
Well, so in passing, you mentioned that AI eventually maybe do everything better than us, better at things than we are. And it's funny, when ChatGPT came to the market, it was so extraordinary that it could do anything like that at all. And after a week, we were so amazed by it. Now, after whatever number of months it's been, it's it's kind of mediocre. At least that's my take. But I'm not sure I could write a better poem praising Megan McArdle than Gemini did. So I just want to say that was spot on. Megan, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.